All right. Today we have one more stop in client land before we make our way over to server land, which we will begin discussing next week. And that stop is with Jquery. And I can really empathize with you that in this class, because one of the challenges of this class is we do cover a lot of topics. And that can be difficult, especially when you're first learning. You know, it's difficult for me to be well versed in these languages and variations of languages myself. And sometimes it's easy to lose track of where you're at and get confused. But at any rate, we're going to talk about Jquery today. All right, and Jquery in principle is very simple, and in execution it's actually fairly simple as well. So Jquery is not per se a new language. Jquery is simply a library of functions that make your life easier to do JavaScript. So let's see what W3 Schools says about Jquery. Nice succinct definition. Jquery is a JavaScript library. What do I mean by library? I mean it's a collection of functions. All right. You can write your own collection of functions. If there's something that you do a lot of times on a lot of different pages in JavaScript, you could write a function to do that and put it in its own little source file and include that on all of your pages. And then that functionality is available to you on any pages. Well, the makers of Jquery did that for you. They've created a whole bunch of JavaScript functions and they put them in a library, and you can use these functions within your JavaScript code to make your life easier as far as writing JavaScript goes. And it's relatively easy to learn. All right. Here, for example, is an example of a Jquery function. It's a function that allows us to hide paragraphs. All right. What this function does simply is, this is equivalent to saying when the page is finished loading. We've had syntax for that. This adds a click function to every paragraph that says when the paragraph is clicked on to hide that paragraph. So click on it, it disappears. Click on it, it disappears. Click on it, it disappears. Run it again, you can get rid of it. Now, we certainly could write this in JavaScript. All right. Jquery doesn't really allow you to do anything that you could not do in ordinary JavaScript. It simply makes it more simple for you by giving you a library of functions that you can use. Right, so in this case, to hide all paragraph elements, you simply do this. If we were doing this in JavaScript, we would have to do any number of things. We could give each paragraph an ID and hide each ID similarly. We could get all of the elements by tag and pull up all the paragraphs into an array and loop through all of the elements and hide each one individually. But this allows us in one line to hide every paragraph on the page. I have a Jquery example that I've adapted from W3 Schools. Which I'll load up now and we'll take a look at it. And we'll compare what the Jquery says with the corresponding JavaScript functions and statements. Well, I have actually two of them. If I double click on this one, it opens it up. I can show all paragraphs. If I click on each paragraph individually, it will disappear. This one, however, will not. In fact, it displays a new paragraph sort of taunting us. And this one does nothing. Show all paragraphs shows everything. Let's look at the code that does this. All right, first of all, this says that when the page finishes loading. Now, we've done that in JavaScript before. If we look at one of our JavaScript examples from a few weeks back. Long example, bear with me 1 second here. This is the one I wanted. I'll open this up also in Visual Studio Code so we can look at side by side. All right, this also is the wrong example. Where is the correct example at? If this doesn't work, I'll just simply quit and go home. 3 strikes, you're out. All right, here we go. In this example, I say window add event listener load for the page load event. All right. And here's the page load event. Here we say document ready function. These two things accomplish the same thing. So if you look, it's slightly simple. Now, one thing I forgot to mention, which is very important, I forgot to mention a very important thing, and that is in order to make Java or jQuery rather work, you need that library of functions included on your page. That's what this line says right here. This actually goes out to this web server and pulls down jQuery min.js. Now, we talked about min files before. That's files with all the spaces removed, which again can really save on bandwidth, especially if you have a very active site. If we looked at this file, it's going to be very difficult for us to read, but we can see some things in it. We see nothing but a bunch of JavaScript functions. This code is very difficult to read. Now, how do you obtain this jQuery file? Okay, you can download the file. Or you can link to the code online. To download the file, here's a list of compressed production of 3.61 or uncompressed. Here is the compressed version, which looks a lot like what we looked at a minute ago. The uncompressed version looks like this. And you can see this is very complex code, but it is just basically just plain old JavaScript. There's just a lot of it though. But these libraries allow us to do these things very quickly. If you don't want to download it onto your application and download the server, you can link to it using any one of these different possibilities. CDN, I believe, stands for Content Delivery Network. You can link to Google, Microsoft, or these other two services. And you do so simply by putting this little snippet of code in there. And that's what we've done in this example. I've linked to this version. Now, this isn't the newest version, but this is a little bit older version. But it still contains most of the basic functionality. So what does this say? Instead of using that lengthy get element by ID function that can pick up one thing, or get element by tag name, or get element by query, we can simply use this $, parenthesis, and enclosed in quotes, sort of the CSS selector that we would use. So .disappear means everything with a class of disappear. So if we wanted just an HTML tag, we wanted every paragraph, we would put a P here. If we wanted a specific paragraph, we could put the ID there. But in this case, we want all those things that have a class of disappear. And what do we want to do? We want to set the click function for it. When we click it, we execute this function. And this says fade out this being the thing that we have clicked on. Fade out is a Jquery function, and if we look at this really closely, we'll see that it doesn't just disappear, but there's a bit of animation. So if we click on this, kind of subtle, but it fades out. And that animation, again, you could do that just in plain old JavaScript. It's not as though Jquery does anything that JavaScript couldn't. It just allows us to do it in a concise way. It's these pre-written functions that you can use on it as a framework to build on top of. Now, what do you think this one means? We have $, and then we have enclosed in quotes, $btn restore. Well, the pound sign tells you that it's looking for something that has a specific ID. And in this case, it's this button that has an ID of btn restore. And when we click on it, we want all those things that have this, all those things with the class of disappear to fade in. When we click show all paragraphs, it fades in. Notice that that happens even if we click on it, but since it's already visible, we can't really appreciate the fade in effect. Finally, but not me, on click yell at user, we really don't need this. in here because we've assigned the things with a class of no disappear, this click function that sets the HTML of the ID called error message to I told you so. So we actually could get rid of this onClick event. Really not sure what it's there. That's how we might do it if we were not using jQuery. But this assigns the click event in jQuery. So even without it, it's added a plus somewhere. This page. Interesting. That plus come from? Must be something I had it in. Oh, there it is. So this sets the HTML. How would we do that in regular JavaScript? Well, we'd either access the inner HTML property, or we would create a text node and add it to the error message ID. Again, does what we've done in JavaScript, but just does it in a much more concise manner. In order for this to work, though, we have to have loaded the jQuery, either by downloading the file off of jQuery server and including it, or by just pointing to it on one of these content delivery networks. Let's look at the other example. Here's code to do a calculation. In this code, the manager, the associate, and the trainee gets charged a different amount based on their number of credit, a number of hours that they've worked. So a manager that works 40 hours gets paid $600. So they must make $15 an hour? Yeah, $15 an hour. An associate gets paid $12 an hour, and a trainee gets paid $10 an hour. All right, let's look at this using jQuery. And in this example, I believe I put side by side, at least in some cases, the appropriate JavaScript statement, corresponding JavaScript statement. Now, one thing to remember, with jQuery, we are simply writing JavaScript code. We are taking advantage, though, of a pre-written library that allows us to take shortcuts for doing things. Like this one, for example, which we had looked at before. All right. So we're adding a click event to that button process. Say when you click on it, execute calculate results. Now, because all jQuery is JavaScript using some pre-written JavaScript functions, we can mix and match. We can put our jQuery code in the middle of JavaScript functions. So if we look at calculate results, or if we look at process form, We have just a plain old vanilla JavaScript statement that says if validate form is true, calculate results. Let's look at validate form. This statement is the equivalent of this statement. We blank out the error section of our page. We do that based on ID. It's a section. And we blank it out. We set be valid to true. We set our error message to be a UL tag to begin with. We get the values from the text box with an ID of text hours. This is how you would do that in plain old vanilla JavaScript. This is how we do it in jQuery. Pound sign indicates an ID, so give me the value of the thing that has an ID of txt value. So notice how concise that is compared to this. Does the same thing. Doesn't matter to me which one of these that you use if you have a problem like this. All right? But it is available for you if you want. If hours are equal to nothing, then be valid as false and add on to error message li must enter hours. Now that's just a plain old vanilla JavaScript statement. We're creating an li or an unordered list that contains a bunch of LIs that indicate all the problems. The rest of this function is plain old JavaScript. Do what's comfortable for you, right? If jQuery is more comfortable, there is jQuery syntax for these things. But you could also just write plain old JavaScript for them. When I'm done, I fill up that error area with what I've accumulated in error message, which is a UL HTML tag that contains a bunch of list items. So for example, when we load the page, if I don't make any selection, I hit calculate, must enter hours, must choose job type. What that's saying is, as we went through, these things were true. This was true, hours was not a number. We can also test to see if hours are less than 0. And get type is equal to an empty string. What's get type? Get type loops through and pulls a value from the radio button. It sees which radio button was checked. RBS, get element by name, RB type, and we loop through and we see which one was selected. Now, we could do that in jQuery if we want to, because this looks like a little bit awkward of a code. So let's see if there's a jQuery instruction that allows us to get the value of a radio button. jQuery get value of radio button. This is a statement that does this. Comment out this code. Radio value, change that to results. Equals input name equals gender. That would be if we had, we could do that if we did not have a, we could do that here by just putting in name equals RB type. And this one line of jQuery replaces this. Now again, it's one of those things that's a matter of what you're used to. My suggestion for learning jQuery is as you're writing JavaScript statements, look to see if you can find the equivalent jQuery statement. And at first, writing this statement might look confusing, but after you've done it a few times, you see that writing one line of code like this is much simpler than writing a bunch of lines of code like this. "10 hours manager," and that doesn't work. What can I do? I can log the value of results and see, oh, I say results. Should be result. Never mind. Had me scratching my head for a second there. And it works. Doesn't give us an error though if there's nothing there. Weird. Let's log the value of result to see what it is. Possibly it's null instead of an empty string, in which case I might need to tweak my code a little bit. Undefined, yeah. I have to change that to say instead of equals empty string, if it equals to null. And that should take care of it. Back in business. Can't tell you how valuable that console log message is. Allows us to really see what the values of different variables are if things are not working the way that you want them to. I would comment out these before I put it in production or delete them. But again, while you're debugging, they're very useful. All right, so calculate results. Initializing the rate to 0. I'm getting the type. I'm getting the rate for that type. It's just a series of if statements, which we could look up to see jQuery. Look to see how jQuery implements a case statement. And it's just standard JavaScript. We could use if statements or we could use a case statement. There isn't something specifically in jQuery for that. We get the rate, we multiply, and we do a little calculation. If it's an associate or a trainee, they get paid overtime. They get paid half their rate for every hour's over 40. Otherwise, they just get paid straight time if they're a manager. This is just plain old JavaScript, and we do this, which again, in JavaScript, in jQuery rather, this statement we could replace with now. Tutorials on W3 Schools allow us to do a whole bunch of other things too. And I encourage you to check out as much as you want to as far as this, how to hide and show things, how to make things move, slide, gets and sets, and so on. Now, here's something that we can do if we're using sort of an add-on to jQuery. And there's a couple of add-ons to jQuery. I'll talk about one and I'll show you the other. And the one I'm going to show you will start off first, and that is called Jquery Ui. And I believe I have an example of that, or I have a link to their page, one of the two. Jquery Ui is a set of user interface interactions, effects, widgets, and themes built on top of the jQuery. So we have JavaScript at the root. We have jQuery, which is built on top of JavaScript. We have then Jquery Ui, which is built on top of jQuery. This allows us to do some pretty cool things as far as the user interface goes. For example, we can implement this accordion control. What I mean by accordion control, it means that it's a series of sections that if we click on the header of one, that section appears as far as animation goes, using an animation, and the other one, other sections disappear. How do we do that? This shows you how to do that. Now, we need to include the jQuery library. We also need to include the Jquery Ui library. And we need to include the Jquery Ui CSS. Or, what did I say? Did I say CSS? Yeah, CSS. Once you do that, then, that accordion control is implemented by this very simple command. Provided you have things set up this way, that each of your divs or sections is wrapped by something with an ID of accordion, and each section consists of a H3 or a header and a div that follows, or section that follows. If you do that, then you can say this ID, I want it to act like an accordion, and it's smart enough to know that means if you click on the header to show the section underneath it. Your assignment for this week is to take that first assignment that you did, had information about JavaScript, Ajax, and PHP, and put it in an accordion control. And that might seem like a daunting task until you look at and realize how Jquery Ui works and how it makes writing code like this very concise. There's a lot of other effects that we can do. Remember, we had to do one with tabs. These are Jquery Ui widget for tabs. And again, the code to do it is very concise. We create a wrapper sort of around these things. We put these tabs in and then we say, I want that ID of tabs to work like a tab. And that works. Now there's more elaborate options. You can make it sortable, so it will sort the tabs, and it gets more elaborate from there. You can make it so it opens on mouse over. So instead of having to click on the tab, if you just hover over the mouse, you can make it to collapse content. I think that makes it just as big as it needs to be. Vertical tabs. And it shows you the source code for all of these things, how to do that. Now, this is sort of a good news and bad news scenario. Because if you think about CSS for a second, it's possible you could be getting CSS for an element of your page from your CSS file. You could be getting it from Bootstrap, and you could be getting it from Jquery Ui. How do you know what CSS applies to something? Well, you go in Developers Tools, look at Elements. As you go through the code, and hover over a section of code like this div, it'll show me down there the elements, the style sheet elements and where they come from. That's using the element and inspecting an element. We can actually test this out by playing around with it. By changing the value of things. I did that right. You can't do that. That could be an effective tool. Now again, to get this Jquery Ui to work, you have to include, it's the same thing. You have to include, though, in addition to the JavaScript included in your code, a link to it or download it, you have to use, you optionally have to use the CSS, or you need to use the CSS associated with it as well. And here's some other things that we'll do. It gives you different checkboxes. Gives you different dialogue that will pop up. Instead of the plain old alert buttons. Gives you a date picker. Pick from a calendar. The spinner control. So on. These are things to consider and to play with. They're shortcuts for you. So rather than having to reinvent the wheel and doing all this work, these are pre-written pieces of functionality that you can include in your web pages. One last thing that I'm going to talk about today is Jquery Mobile. And Jquery Mobile is, again, Jquery Mobile is no longer supported. Well, let's forget about this one. This is, I didn't realize this. This was done about a year ago. So forget I said anything about Jquery Mobile. All right. I hope this helps. Next week is going to be a big week because we're going to start talking about server-side technologies. And that's going to be a whole new set of concerns and items and all that. I know there's a lot of stuff in this course, as I mentioned before. If you run into any difficulty at all, please let me know. And I'll do my best to help you with this. As I mentioned before, I know some of you are behind. And I encourage you to seek assistance if you are not up to date on your assignments. That's all I had for today. We will talk to you next week.